I thought I had the perfect life, a loving wife, a growing career, and a future full of promise. But one shocking discovery turned my world upside down, setting me on a path of betrayal, revenge, and unexpected redemption. I grew up in a quiet, close-knit town in Texas where the saying "everyone knows everyone" couldn't have been more accurate. My childhood was unique, shaped by my father's work as a translator at the U.S. Embassy. His job meant I grew up hearing fascinating stories about different countries and languages. When I turned 18, life took a dramatic turn. My father's career brought our family to England, where he accepted a new role, and I found myself attending college in a place I'd only dreamed about, Oxford. During my years at Oxford, I dove headfirst into computer technology, business management, and economics. The rigorous academic environment challenged me, but I thrived in it, forging friendships that have stood the test of time. One of those bonds was with my younger sister, Patricia, or Pat, as I call her. She wasn't just family, she became one of my closest confidants. After graduating, I was eager to return to the United States and carve out my own path. My name is Dan Colton. Before I delve into the more challenging parts of my story, let me introduce you to someone central to it, my ex-wife, Emily. I've always been a firm believer in staying active. Most mornings, you'll find me jogging a couple of laps around the park or swimming several miles a week. I also hit an old-school gym twice weekly for weightlifting and MMA training. While I'm far from a martial arts expert, I can hold my own. At 5 feet 10 inches and 180 pounds, most of my weight is muscle. Fitness is a vital part of my life, it keeps me grounded. Despite my academic achievements, a master's in computer technology, a postgraduate degree in business management, and a bachelor's in economics from Oxford, people often tell me I bear a passing resemblance to George Clooney. I find it amusing, though the comparison doesn't hold much weight in the tech world where I now work. After Oxford, my father returned to the U.S. and transitioned into a role as a computer repair specialist following his years of service. I stayed to finish my studies before eventually joining him stateside. Today, I manage a prominent company that's developing an innovative program. This software has applications ranging from gaming to military use, and its ability to process real-time issues is critical. We're on track to roll it out within 6 months to a year, a project I'm deeply proud of. Now, back to Pat. She's 2 years younger than me and works as a junior partner at a prestigious New York law firm. We're incredibly close, sharing almost everything with each other and keeping no secrets. She's always been my rock, even when life threw curveballs my way. And then there's Emily. My ex-wife is strikingly beautiful, with fiery red hair, green eyes, and an angelic face that could light up any room with her smile. She's petite, standing at 5 feet 3 inches, with a figure that turns heads, balanced with a sharp wit and an equally fiery temper. Fitness is her passion too, she spends at least 4 days a week at the gym. Emily is a corporate attorney at XYZ, a PR and advertising firm, where she climbed the ranks after earning her law degree. We met under serendipitous circumstances at Pat's graduation party. Pat, her roommate Amy, and Emily's sister all played matchmaker, introducing us that evening. By pure coincidence, Emily and I discovered we lived only 3 miles apart in Freestone, a mid-sized Texas town. 6 months later, we started dating, and within another 6 months, we were married. After our wedding, Emily launched her career at XYZ as a junior attorney. While her starting salary was modest, bonuses and her drive to succeed set her on a promising path. For a time, life felt perfect. But as you'll soon learn, perfection is often an illusion. I worked as a software engineer for ABC flight controllers, where I specialized in assembling and debugging complex software code. The job came with a mid-5-figure salary and occasional bonuses. It wasn't glamorous, but it provided stability. I lived in a 3-bedroom house I'd inherited from my grandparents. It was in a good neighborhood, a quiet place that felt like home. Meanwhile, my sister, Pat, received a lump sum inheritance, and Emily's family, her parents and sister, remained in New York. My parents had retired to Florida, enjoying a well-deserved life of leisure. Twice a year, our extended families came together to celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas, rotating between different homes. At that time, life felt good. We were comfortable with our modest incomes, drove reliable cars, and treated ourselves to 2 vacations every year. Emily and I were happy, or so I thought. After 2 years, Emily's hard work paid off, and she was promoted to junior partner at XYZ. That's when I started noticing changes. She began going out with her friends on Friday nights a few times a month. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, she was celebrating her success. But then, her late nights at the office became more frequent, and I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Suspicion crept in, and I found myself doing things I'm not proud of. I started monitoring her emails, inspecting her clothing for anything out of place, and even installed a keylogger on her laptop. I knew these actions bordered on paranoia, but something deep inside me felt off. My trust in her was wavering. One night, I even followed her. To my relief, or perhaps frustration, nothing inappropriate happened. She didn't even dance with other men. But the unease lingered. Why couldn't I shake the feeling that something was wrong in our marriage? Emily had made it clear she wanted to become a senior partner before starting a family. That would take another 5 years, and while she was thriving professionally, I was stagnating. My job at ABC Flight Controllers was going nowhere. As a family-owned business, promotions were reserved for relatives, regardless of their qualifications. It felt like I was spinning my wheels while Emily's career soared. Determined to change my trajectory, I decided to start my own computer repair and IT solutions business. But this wasn't going to be the typical, bring your laptop to the shop, setup. I aimed to cater to businesses, offering enhanced security systems and advanced system upgrades. Before diving in, I conducted a detailed business analysis. I knew the first year would be tough, but I projected that by the end of it, I'd be earning more than I was at my current job. When I sat down to discuss my plans with Emily, I kept the explanation straightforward, avoiding the mention of the new software I was secretly developing to keep the conversation simple. I assured her that the initial challenges would be worth it in the long run. But she was completely against the idea. She couldn't understand why I would risk the stability we had when, in her eyes, things were going well. Emily and I had always kept our finances separate, except for a joint account we used for household bills. We each contributed equally and saved the rest for ourselves. Her hesitation didn't deter me. I left my job and poured my savings, along with a loan against my house, into starting the business. I rented a small workshop with an attached office and began advertising while making cold calls to potential clients. The first 3 months were grueling, but I was pleased to be breaking even by the end of the quarter. Meanwhile, my work on the software project was progressing better than I'd hoped. Things were starting to look up. And then Emily dropped a bombshell. One evening, she came home and announced that she was 3 months pregnant, with twins. At first, I was shocked, but the surprise quickly turned to joy. Or at least, it should have. Instead, something gnawed at me, and my mind began connecting dots that I didn't want to see. I thought back to her business trip to Miami around the time she would have conceived. She had been gone for an entire week. A chilling thought struck me: what if she had been unfaithful? The moment Emily announced her pregnancy, doubts flooded my mind. I decided right then to get a DNA test as soon as possible after the twins were born. From the moment she revealed the news, her affection toward me seemed to vanish. She insisted we abstain from intimacy, claiming it might harm the babies. Both the doctor and I reassured her she was overreacting, but she wouldn't hear it. Despite the growing distance between us, I did my best to be a supportive husband. I went to all her prenatal relaxation classes, massaged her feet every night, rubbed oil on her belly to prevent stretch marks, and did everything I could to help. Yet, Her sour moods grew worse, and it was clear she didn't appreciate my efforts. Meanwhile, my company was thriving. I had hired Greg, a talented young computer technician, and May, a receptionist who kept everything running smoothly. Emily showed no interest in my business, so I stopped trying to discuss it with her. She never asked about my work, and I kept our conversations focused on the pregnancy and her needs. The big day finally arrived. I was with a client, presenting plans for a server upgrade, when I got the call. Emily had gone into labor. The client congratulated me and sent me off immediately. I rushed home, grabbed her pre-packed hospital bag and the DNA kit, and drove straight to the hospital. Emily was already in a private room in the prenatal ward when I arrived. She looked uncomfortable but determined. The doctors assured us everything was progressing normally. I stayed by her side, holding her hand through the entire ordeal, doing everything I could to support her. After hours of labor, our twins were born, a boy and a girl. Exhausted but relieved, Emily was moved to the recovery unit to rest. The doctors advised me to go home and get some sleep. I left reluctantly, knowing she was in good hands, and promised to return first thing in the morning. The next day, I couldn't contain my excitement. I called family and friends to share the wonderful news. The grandparents were over the moon and couldn't wait to meet their new grandchildren. Pat and Amy promised to take time off work to visit their niece and nephew soon. On my way to the hospital, I stopped to drop off the DNA kit at the lab, knowing the results would take about 10 days. When I arrived at the hospital, carrying flowers for Emily, I was met with an unexpected twist. The nurse on duty informed me that Emily had experienced severe tearing during delivery and would need extra care during her stay. That morning, however, something changed. Hours later, I received a call that made my blood run cold. The hospital staff informed me that Emily had left. Worse, she hadn't gone alone. She had left with a man. They knew who he was but refused to disclose his identity. Stunned, I demanded answers. What am I supposed to do now? I asked, my voice shaking. Go home, Mr. Colton, they said. We will be in touch. I returned home in a daze, my mind racing. Who was this man? What had Emily been planning all along? My thoughts spiraled into chaos as I sat on the couch, clutching my phone, waiting for some kind of update. By 6 p.m., there was a knock at my door. 2 detectives stood there, their faces somber. Neither could meet my gaze, which immediately set me on edge. What's going on? I asked, my voice breaking under the weight of my own dread. The female detective finally spoke. Mr. Colton, she began cautiously, we can't disclose where your wife is or the circumstances under which she left. But there's more to this than we can share right now. You'll need to be patient. I don't want excuses, I told the detective, my frustration boiling over. Just call Emily and get back to me. By lunchtime, I couldn't bear sitting in the house any longer, so I headed to Denny's, craving the comfort of greasy food and a cold beer. I ordered their biggest burger, with a side of fries, onion rings, and a tall glass of beer. It wasn't exactly a healthy meal, but it dulled the sharp edge of my emotions. Afterward, I drove home to the same unsettling emptiness. Checking the answering machine offered no solace, no messages. I flipped on the TV, but my mind refused to cooperate, endlessly replaying the chaos of the last few days. By midnight, I admitted defeat and went to bed, though sleep remained elusive. Thoughts of Emily and the twins swirled endlessly. At 6 a.m., I gave up trying to rest. The sun was just starting to rise when a knock at the door startled me. Still half asleep, I rushed to answer it without checking the peephole, a mistake I'd soon regret. The door slammed inward with such force that I stumbled back, barely staying on my feet. Before I could react, 3 men barged in. Their intent was clear. Fully awake now, adrenaline surged through me as I struck the first man in the throat with a hard jab of my knuckles. He staggered, gasping for air, but the others rushed me. Then everything went dark. The next time I woke, sunlight streamed through a window, filling the room with a harsh brightness that made me wince. My head throbbed as I tried to take in my surroundings. A figure sat in a chair nearby, and it took me a moment to recognize her. "Cam," I rasped, though the sound barely escaped my parched throat. Cam, the wife of my MMA instructor, Nick Wright, stood and pressed the call button. Moments later, a nurse entered, checking my vitals with a warm smile. "You're awake. How are you feeling?" she asked gently. I tried to respond, but my mouth was too dry. She handed me an ice chip, and as it melted on my tongue, it tasted better than the finest scotch I'd ever had. Cam explained what had happened. The attackers had left me unconscious and bleeding. Thankfully, the police had found my phone and called Nick, listed under ICE, in case of emergency. He and Cam had been by my side ever since. Nick joined us later, and his words brought clarity to the extent of my injuries: a fractured left tibia, a shattered radius, 2 cracked ribs, a perforated lung, a damaged kidney, a cracked eye socket, and a broken nose. He tried to lighten the mood, saying, "Other than that, you're fine." It managed to coax a weak smile from me. When Nick and Cam left to get some rest, Detective Graham Cole entered the room. His presence was calm but serious as he asked, "How much do you remember about the attack?" I recounted what I could: the initial knock, the forceful entry, the moment I struck the first man. His questions were thorough, each one helping me piece together fragments of memory. Before leaving, Detective Cole reassured me that I still had visitation rights for my children and offered to take on my case. Despite the chaos, it was a small glimmer of hope. When Nick returned, his steady presence kept me grounded. I realized that the road ahead was going to be long and uncertain, but for the first time in days, I felt a shred of determination. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to give up. Sorting through the stack of mail Nick had brought me, I came across the envelope I had been dreading, and waiting for: the DNA results. My hands trembled as I opened it. The truth lay in the stark black and white of the report: neither of the twins was mine. For a moment, rage coursed through me, heating my face and tightening my chest. But then, unexpectedly, I started to laugh. It was a deep, bitter laugh, one that came from the absurdity of it all. Emily hadn't just betrayed me, she had been cheating on both Jimmy and me. She was a textbook cheater, tangled in her own web of lies. When I calmed down enough, I explained the situation to Nick. His face turned pale as he listened, and I could see him struggling to process the sheer madness of it all. Once my laughter subsided, I resolved to take control of the chaos Emily had created. A few days later, we met with our attorneys to finalize the settlement. Grace, my lawyer, handed over the paperwork she had prepared to Emily's attorney. Emily and Jimmy sat across from me, their expressions ranging from smug to uncomfortable. Grace began to speak, her tone firm and professional. "Here is our revised settlement offer. Let me break it down for you. My client keeps the house, all its contents, his savings, his business, both cars, and his wife's jewelry. Additionally, Emily is required to deposit the $188,000 from her secret marital credit account into my client's attorney's holding account." Emily's face flushed a deep crimson, her jaw tightening. "You can't have that money," she sputtered, her voice rising in anger. "That's my money." I stayed calm, watching as she fought to control her temper. Grace, unfazed, continued. "Your client's financial misconduct is well documented. If this goes to court, the evidence we have will support our case entirely." Jimmy, clearly agitated, leaned forward and barked, "We're not here to fight over everything. We just want 20%. I raised an eyebrow and replied evenly, "Excuse me, did you say 20%? "Yes. 20%, he repeated, as though daring me to challenge him. "Interesting," I said, folding my hands. "Is this a number you just pulled out of thin air, or do you have any legitimate basis for it?" Jimmy bristled. It's perfectly reasonable, he snapped. No, it isn't, I said, my voice steady. I've done my research, thorough research. Your company is publicly traded, which means all your revenue and client information is available online. It's clear to me that this 20% claim is baseless nonsense. But go ahead, keep pushing, let's see how this impacts your father's congressional campaign. Jimmy's face turned ashen at the mention of his father's political ambitions, and the room fell silent. Later that evening, back in my hospital room, Grace asked me something that had been on her mind. Why did you give in and let Jimmy adopt the kids? I handed her the DNA test results, letting them speak for themselves. She skimmed the paper and laughed. You clever man, she said, shaking her head. The kids aren't yours. No, I said quietly, they're not. Emily was cheating on both Jimmy and me. I plan to make sure he knows the full story. Grace smirked. Dan, I'd hate to be on your bad side. You'd make a fantastic attorney. Thanks, I said with a faint smile. But I don't have your killer instinct. She shrugged. You just haven't tapped into it yet. The doctor came in shortly after and informed me that I was cleared to go home. Nick arrived to take me back, and on the way, we talked about the next steps. When he hesitated, I encouraged him to speak his mind. Well, he began, I was wondering about your house. My son Eric just graduated with an engineering degree. He's getting married soon, and they need a place to live. Would you consider renting the house to him? I agreed without hesitation. Set the rent at whatever they can afford, and use the money to start a college fund for their future baby. Cam hugged me so tightly it nearly knocked the breath out of me. In that moment, I realized I still had people in my life who genuinely cared for me, and I was determined not to let the chaos of Emily's betrayal define my future. The day after the attack, my body ached as though the assault had happened all over again. Every breath was a painful reminder of my fractured ribs. Despite the discomfort, I was grateful to be alive. Nick, ever the steady presence, stayed by my side, and for the first time since everything started, he broke down in tears. It caught me off guard. Nick, my rock, was crying, for me. It was humbling and deeply moving. Later, I called my sister Patty to update her. She had been my biggest cheerleader since the beginning of this ordeal. Her upbeat nature had always been a source of comfort, and even over the phone, her voice radiated warmth and encouragement. Patty had always had a knack for matchmaking, though I often resented her meddling. Years ago, she'd introduced me to Amy during a casual dinner party. You two look like a perfect couple, Patty had teased, causing Amy to blush. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I excused myself to the restroom, overwhelmed by the unexpected comment. That evening, I tried to navigate the awkwardness by dancing with both Amy and Patty, steering clear of the slow songs. At the end of the night, we put Amy in a cab and called one for ourselves. Patty just laughed when we got home, ignoring my grumbles about her matchmaking schemes. The next day, Patty and I went house hunting. I'd always envisioned owning a house instead of living in an apartment. To me, a house symbolized stability, backyard barbecues, friends gathering on the patio, and plenty of space to build a future. Though prices were high, I couldn't help but dream. Amy and I remained friends for a while, close, but not quite romantically involved. One evening, Patty and Amy planned to go to the theater, but Patty canceled at the last minute, leaving just Amy and me. We went to see The Taming of the Shrew, and during the performance, Amy unexpectedly reached over and grabbed my hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Up until then, the most affection we'd shared was the occasional kiss on the cheek. After the play, we took a taxi to her apartment. As I prepared to head home, I cursed under my breath when I realized no more cabs were running that late so far out of town. Laughing, Amy said, "Then you'd better stay." From that moment on, things shifted. We started spending more time together, and before long, it felt like we just fit. Even Patty noticed and often commented on how happy we seemed together. During this time, I poured myself into my tech project, which I'd been quietly developing for years. The beauty of the program and hardware I'd created was its versatility. It could be adapted for gaming, military applications, aviation, and even automotive industries. I knew the best way to test its limits was through gaming, where users would push the system to its breaking point. With this in mind, I approached a major game development company, though they were initially skeptical. Despite their doubts, I convinced them to give the system a chance. The results were better than I'd hoped, and word spread quickly. My program became a sensation, earning me a level of wealth I'd never imagined. With basic investments alone, I was looking at an annual income exceeding $12 million before taxes. Meanwhile, my personal life flourished. Patty was happily renting her apartment and dating another attorney, while Amy and I had moved in together. Our relationship grew stronger every day, and I began to imagine a future with her, a future I hadn't thought possible after everything Emily had done to me. A year into my new life, I decided it was time for some payback against those who had hurt me. One evening, over dinner, I shared my thoughts with Amy. "I still want to get back at your sister," I said, watching her reaction carefully. Amy smirked and replied, "Burn the witch. I'll help if you want me to." That night, we went to a restaurant to celebrate a small win in my business. Over a glass of wine, I glanced across the room and froze. Emily and Jimmy were there, seated with another couple, laughing as though their lives were untouched by the chaos they'd caused. Amy noticed my sudden tension and excused herself to use the powder room, Cam following close behind. They had to pass by Emily's table on their way, and I watched, waiting for their reaction. I watched from across the restaurant as Emily froze, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Amy had greeted her casually, then pointed toward me and said something that made Cam burst into laughter. Emily's face paled, and she quickly gathered her things, rushing out with Jimmy trailing behind her. When Amy and Cam returned to our table, I couldn't hide my curiosity. "What did you say to her?" I asked. Amy grinned mischievously. "Oh, nothing too harsh." After Cam said hello, Emily asked who I was with. I just smiled and replied, "I'm with the man she could never deserve." Cam chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment. "You should have seen her face. Priceless." I couldn't help but laugh, imagining the sting Emily must have felt. It was a small victory but a satisfying one. A few weeks later, the legal fallout from the attack was finalized. 2 of the men involved received lengthy prison sentences, while the third, who had a clean record, was given a reduced sentence of 5 years. Justice had been served, and I could finally breathe a little easier. Before heading to the airport for a long overdue vacation with Amy, Nick and Cam dropped us off. As we said our goodbyes, I handed Nick an envelope and told him not to open it until after our plane had taken off. Inside were the deeds to my old house, a wedding gift for his son, Eric. I had discussed it with Eric privately, emphasizing the importance of honoring his own wedding vows. After settling back home, I decided it was time to reconnect with family. I called Patty and invited her and her partner to dinner without mentioning it to Amy. On Friday, as the doorbell rang, Amy opened the door and was met with warm hugs from Patty. The evening was filled with laughter, good food, and reminiscing about old times. Not long after, Amy and I finally took the honeymoon we'd been dreaming of, a 2-week Caribbean cruise. Each day was an adventure, with excursions to beautiful islands and romantic evenings spent dancing under the stars. By the time we returned home, we were utterly exhausted but deeply content. With my troubleshooting team fully operational, I was able to take things slower, allowing me to savor life with Amy while quietly planning the next steps in my quest for retribution. 9 months later, our son James was born, and a year after that, he was joined by his little sister, Sarah. We moved into a larger house to accommodate our growing family, but we made sure to stay within the safety and comfort of our community. 2 months after Sarah's birth, Nick called me with unexpected news. Jimmy had kicked Emily out, citing their ironclad prenup to retain custody of the children he had adopted. Emily, left with nothing, had disappeared. Curious but cautious, Amy reached out to Emily's parents to see if they knew where she had gone. Her father's response was cold and dismissive. "Don't contact us again," he said bluntly. "We've already wired her a couple of thousand, but that's the last she'll get from us." It was clear that Emily was now feeling the full weight of betrayal and loss, a dose of her own medicine. Phase 1 of my retribution was complete. Through sheer coincidence, Emily's email account was still active, so I sent her the private investigator's report I had commissioned on Jimmy. It detailed his manipulative behavior and hinted at infidelity. Though she had no one to blame but herself, the irony was hard to ignore. Life moved on for us. Amy and I thrived as a couple, raising James and Sarah in a loving, supportive home. I kept the lessons of the past close, using them to guide my future. Looking back, I realized that retribution wasn't just about evening the score, it was about reclaiming my life and ensuring a better future for my family. When I checked into the motel, I carried little more than my laptop, a couple of $1,000s in my account, and the weight of everything that had happened. Emily's voice trembled as she recounted her story later, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "No one would speak to me after what I did to you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family disowned me." She glanced up briefly before looking away, her shame evident. "I called his father, Barry," she continued, referring to Jimmy's family. "He told me they didn't need me anymore now that he had an heir to the family fortune. My dad finally agreed to talk to me after I begged, but all he did was wire me a few $1,000s and tell me never to call again." Turning to Amy, she added, "I had nowhere else to go." Amy and I exchanged a glance. For now, we decided to let her stay in the guest room while we figured out other options. Later that evening, as Amy tucked the kids in, she said, "I'll take Emily shopping for some basics tomorrow." By the time Emily came back downstairs, she looked more rested. We told her the plan for the next few days, and she started crying again, overwhelmed by the kindness she hadn't expected. The next morning, Emily surprised us by preparing breakfast, coffee and buttered toast. She joined Amy and me at the table, her voice breaking as she said, "Dan, Amy, I'm so lucky. I didn't expect this kindness after everything I've done." As Amy and Emily headed out to shop for essentials, I stayed behind to manage the house. By the afternoon, they had returned, arms full of bags, and set about organizing the new items. Watching them work together, it was as though the pieces of Emily's shattered life were beginning to find their place. To help her rebuild, we gave Emily a credit card with a $1,000 monthly limit and $10,000 for her checking account. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Amy hugged me tightly. "I'm glad you didn't kick Emily while she was down," she said softly. I sighed. "I hope she's learned her lesson and treats her next partner better. Everyone deserves a second chance, if they're willing to change." The following week, my focus shifted to the long-awaited legal battles. Though my settlement with XYZ Advertising included a non-disclosure agreement, preventing me from involving them in the divorce proceedings, I was now free to pursue other avenues. I planned to seek $10 million in damages for alienation of affection, holding Jimmy and XYZ accountable for their roles in the affair. I provided my lawyer, Brian, with DNA reports proving that Troy Simmons, not me, was the father of Emily's children. This revelation invalidated Jimmy's claim to custody, as the adoption was technically void. Emily could reclaim her children if she chose to. "This isn't just about money," I clarified to Brian. "It's about making sure everyone responsible for this mess is held accountable." Brian laid out a multi-pronged strategy. We would sue Troy Simmons for sexual misconduct, as evidence showed he coerced Emily into an affair to keep her job. Next, we would file against Jimmy Prescott for his role in destroying my marriage. Finally, we'd target XYZ Advertising for enabling a toxic workplace culture that facilitated these events. A week later, as I left Brian's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Justice was finally within reach. As planned, 2 weeks later, I sent all the gathered evidence to every major media outlet. The fallout was immediate. Reporters camped outside the courthouse and the homes of everyone involved. XYZ's clients began threatening to cut ties, forcing the board to fire Troy Simmons without severance. To stem the damage, Jimmy and Barry Prescott resigned, their reputations in tatters. In a final act of revenge, I used my connections to ensure Jimmy's prison placement put him in the company of particularly dangerous inmates. Meanwhile, Emily started to rebuild her life. She moved into a larger home, retook her bar exams, and joined Patty's law firm. Though we didn't socialize much, we occasionally babysat for each other's children. Emily focused solely on her career and kids, avoiding relationships entirely. Looking back, the journey had been grueling, but seeing justice served and knowing my family was safe made it all worth it. Amy and I continued to build a life of love and resilience, cherishing the peace we had worked so hard to achieve.